Hello, everyone. We are going to discuss chapter 2 in the text. Is everyone really equal? For my students. Of course, you know I'm Dr. David Childs, and we're going to get into chapter 2 by the book that was authored by Sensoi and D'Angelo. Often, of course, when you hear me say Sensei D'Angelo, I'm referring to is everyone really equal? And so let's go ahead and get into that chapter. I'm going to actually share my screen here so y'all can see and follow along. The chapter discusses critical thinking and critical theory. So here goes. You can see my screen there. And hopefully this can help you as you do the readings, get an understanding of some of the concepts. You will notice that this will echo what you're reading, and the idea is to supplement the text. Okay, so as you can see, chapter 2, critical thinking and critical theory. And this chapter will really help us think about living in a multicultural society, living in a diverse society. In words now like diversity, equity, and inclusion have almost become a bad word, but we want to get a good understanding of it. It doesn't mean wokeness or wokeism. By the way, the term woke is a relatively new term. It's not like it's an old ancient theoretical framework. When we talk about some of the other theories like critical theory, that dates back to the early 20th century with the Frankfurt School. When we talk about philosophical traditions like pragmatism, that goes back to the 1800s. And so keep that in mind. Existentialism and these other long-held traditions, even critical race theory goes back to the 1960s. And these are long philosophical traditions. So keep that in mind as we talk about some of these theories. You hear a lot of political talking points that comes and goes. But we want to get a good understanding of this as it relates to leadership as well, your own leadership, whether you are leading in a classroom, whether you are leading a school as a principal or a curriculum director, or as a classroom educator, or as a professor. You want to definitely keep these things in mind as a leader, and then also understanding diverse society, different neighborhoods. Everybody's neighborhood does not look like ours. Okay, so just some introductory thoughts. Now let's look at this idea of critical thinking. You've been seeing this word bandied around in your college education, or even back in high school. Um, to think with complexity, exploring the multiple dimensions of an issue. And I would also add exploring something with an open mind. You do not necessarily have to subscribe to that viewpoint. And newsflash, in this society today, people are going to disagree with you. We should not become unglued because everyone does not see the world the same way we see it. We should not become unglued when people have a differing point of view religiously, politically, socially, educationally, economic policy. People are going to disagree with you and I, with us. And so we do not have to be upset about that. But critical thinking looks at issues from different perspectives and being critical about it, not critical in the sense of being mean and nitpicking, but analytical. Okay, looking at an issue analytically And even looking at different sides of the issue, you don't necessarily have to subscribe to something by looking at different sides of an issue. Critical theory, I alluded to this earlier, it's actually a philosophical tradition. And when I say philosophical tradition, I mean have been scholars of long and of old, in many cases, researching and thinking about this particular tradition. Critical theory, the philosophy, is social philosophy, really, and it's a tool that can be used in thinking critically about something, examining the deep aspects of how society works. Critical theory subscribes to the idea that society is inherently unjust, or as it stands right now, is unequal. The unequal in terms of women's rights, how women are treated in our society. There's somebody now in the political realm that's trying to even disenfranchise women and diminish the women vote and want to go back to so-called traditionalism where women could not vote. And that's an unjust framework. There's racial injustice, there's ethnic injustice, there's economic injustice. And so a critical theorist would start from that framework. In the book, Senso and D'Angelo, they deal with that concept. And so knowing that we live in a society that's socially stratified, a society that is unjust and unequal, what kinds of things ought we be thinking about to make it a more just society? Thinking critically about knowledge. There's the misconceptions about the knowledge that we study in school. We are taught often that there's one answer. That answer stays the same. But we know with research, we often become to understand an issue better. For example, humans used to believe that the earth was the center of the universe. And it was common knowledge even among scientists. But as we kept doing research, as humans, we arrived at a better understanding. We began to learn that was proved to be false. Okay, so that's the nature of knowledge. We may have a certain understanding of something now, but as we do more research, even in my field of history, there are things we once thought, but as we do more archaeological research, and even with American history, we thought, for example, it was widely believed that African Americans played a cursory role in the Underground Railroad, that they played a really minimal role, but we now understand that much of the Underground Railroad was led by African American leaders. It makes much more sense because in the South, for example, a lot of the African Americans had a more intimate knowledge of the terrain and geography and escape routes than their white counterparts. And so just through research and finding letters and primary search documents, we have a better understanding of the Underground Railroad. That's just one example from my own research. Critical thinking involves looking deeper into the facts taught in school. So you do question. You don't question for the sake of questioning or critique for the sake of critiquing, but just challenging some long-held ideas. Like, for example, this false idea that women aren't good at math and sciences. That's a social construct. There's nothing inherent about women that makes them worse at academics than males. That's sexism. It's from a sexist framework, and a critical thinker, and even in the tradition of critical theory, can challenge that. Some dimensions of critical thinking: to seek ideas that question what is thought to be common sense. We have this idea of something is common sense. Oh, that's common sense. Of course, common sense. Or in Spanish, como no, common sense. But we understand common sense can be challenged. We might say it's common sense to think that everybody has access to the computer and the internet nowadays. Oh, it's common sense. Everybody has a phone. But when you think about individuals of low socioeconomic backgrounds, this is so great for those that are in leadership positions, classroom leader, teacher as leader. When you think about individuals from like in rural Kentucky, places where the internet and Wi-Fi is not accessible, you might send homework home and they can't do it in the same way as someone that lives closer to a larger city or in the suburbs where they have a better infrastructure. But that challenges the common sense idea that everybody has technology access today. Because we might assume that from our own framework and our own experiences, but it's just not the case. Another bullet point, the last bullet point, to understand the history and culture of where bits of knowledge come from. So sometimes the culture one comes from determines what knowledge we privilege. Sometimes the culture we come from determines what knowledge we privilege. For example, there is an English that is a type of an accent or a vernacular that is largely comes from white middle class culture. That's a standard English. And people assume one is intelligent or not as intelligent based on their standard English. But that doesn't hold up. That is a social construct that's based on a group of folks throughout history that begin to determine, well, this is the type of English we should speak that's acceptable, or this is the accent. But when you think about folks with a New York accent, think about a rural Kentucky accent, a lot of us, where we're from, that's no reflection on intelligence. But often when a person has an Appalachian accent, it's challenged, like as if that person is ignorant, but that's no reflection on intelligence. And so keep that in mind. That's just a thought, something to process. Critical thinking in relation to this class, a class like this, in relation to the textbook and what they're saying. It's common sense that people should not believe in discrimination. Critical thinking will determine that most discrimination is not on purpose and we do not even realize it. Well, a lot of folks would not come out and say, I'm a racist. In fact, people get really offended if someone says, well, you're prejudiced, you discriminate against individuals because they're poor, you discriminate against an individual because they're from Mexico, or an individual because they're from Asia, or you discriminate against an individual because they're from rural Kentucky. Nobody wants to admit it, but the book wants to push us to think about our own privilege, think about our own biases, and how that affects the way we teach, how that affects the way we deal with people. That's what critical thinking is all about too. So when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and multiculturalism, we start with the self. What are my own struggles? How did I grow up? Maybe one grew up in an environment where everybody looked just like us. You're from a small town. Everybody had the same exact socioeconomic status. You might have somebody that was less poor, a little less poor, so they were considered the wealthy ones in the community. Or maybe we grew up in a society that women did not work, or they were not pushed to go into career, but they were encouraged to be stay-at-home moms. Those kinds of ideas should be challenged or can be challenged. But if we grow up in those environments, maybe we see that as normal. And I want to say, if a woman decides to stay at home and be a stay-at-home mom, I'm not critical of that because it's all about choice. If that's a choice a person wants to make, more power to them. Likewise, conversely, if a dad wants to be a stay-at-home dad, that's also fine as well. Critical theory. So I alluded to this. You remember when I said critical theory is a part of a philosophical tradition, okay? And I almost was comparing it to wokeism. Wokeism is not a philosophical tradition. It is a political talking point to divide people. There was a phenomenon about 6 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, where people that were social justice oriented began to say, well, I'm woke. Well, what happened was political proponents and folks involved in politics begin to say, well, we want to challenge wokeism. That should not apply to this conversation. Critical theory comes from the Frankfurt School. It's a long tradition and body of scholarship that examines how society works. It's a tradition that emerged in the early part of the 20th century from a group of scholars in Germany called the Frankfurt School, the Institute for Social Research. Okay, so what you're looking at now is a long, well-researched topic. You don't have to subscribe to all the ideas, but understand that there were some serious scholars writing and thinking about, there has been serious scholars writing and thinking about this topic for a really long time. And our authors want to lift that framework up into their text by writing about it and giving us a way to think about social justice. These theorists' work was guided by the belief that society should work towards the ideas of equality and social betterment. That's the crux of it with critical theory. Sometimes you'll hear critical pedagogy, and that's this tradition applied to teaching in particular. Okay? Pedagogy is a word that means teaching and learning. And so the crux of it is that we would work towards equality in the social betterment of society. Sounds okay to me. The betterment of children, the betterment of men and women, the betterment of the uplifting women from oppression, the betterment of race and those of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, the betterment of the poor, okay? Giving everybody equal opportunity. Like our book, Is Everyone Really Equal? In the book, challenges this idea that everybody has the same opportunities. We don't. People have different levels of opportunity in our country today. The critical theory analysis expands all the time, deepen as theorists from indigenous, post-colonial, and other perspectives add different layers to it. And so this conversation is always expanding in our understanding of the idea of oppression and how to move forward. Why theory matters. All of us operate from theory. We don't recognize it. Theorizing asks questions of how, why, what. When we ask how or why, are we engaged? How did schools become this way? Why are we always talking about race? You're theorizing. Why are we still talking about race? Why are we still in the university studying social justice? How did the world get here anyway? Why is society still divided after all of these years? How are people still fighting? How did we get to the point where we have a two-party system and people don't get along? You are theorizing. How can I become a better leader? Why are many schools so dysfunctional? You're engaged in educational theory. Theorizing is when a theory can be conceptualized as the learned cultural maps we follow to navigate and make sense of our lives and new things we encounter. For example, if someone doesn't have a lunch at school, are you going to think they forgot it? Or will you think that they can't afford it? Well, either way, you are theorizing to see which one is true. Let's go back to our computer example. When you encounter a student that says, I wasn't able to do my homework on a computer, are you assuming that they're goofing off and they're being rebellious? Or maybe you can go deeper and say, maybe they don't have access to a computer. Often what we do is we apply our framework to them and say, well, I had a computer when I was in school. Why don't they have a computer? But we have to go beyond ourselves and realize the world is vastly different from other people. The way they live might be vastly different from the way we live. A lot of the free and reduced lunch that happens nowadays are more likely taken for granted. Well, and also, free and reduced lunch, using the lunch example, free and reduced lunch is contingent on filling out an application to receive assistance with lunch. But often, if you're in a neighborhood at school that's with a diverse ethnic population that doesn't speak English, often the application is in English. And I've encountered moms and parents that can't fill out the application, so the child is going to school not eating because the family doesn't speak English well and they can't fill out the application to receive free and reduced lunch. Expanding our mind. We're engaged in critical thinking and theorizing right now. The knowledge construction. These are theoretical questions, philosophical questions. How is knowledge produced? So where do we get our knowledge? We're theorizing. Do we get it from television? Do we get it from church or our religious centers? Do we get our knowledge from practical wisdom at home from grandparents, from our mom, from our father? Do we get our knowledge primarily from school? No, actually we don't. It seems like one might think school has a monopoly on the dissemination of knowledge, but if you think about it, much of what we learn comes from, for example, Disney, nowadays YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook videos, films, us film buffs out there, books that we read, the Harry Potter series on unfortunate events that we might have read, comic books. Our knowledge comes from a lot of different places, and the messages come from different places. Sometimes it's a hidden curriculum. So how is knowledge produced? Critical theorists challenge that. Key element to injustice is that particular knowledge is objective, neutral, or universal. And so we have to think about, is knowledge objective, meaning it doesn't change at all? Or is it neutral? Or I don't mean to say or, and neutral and universal. So common sense, the common sense idea is a key element of injustice. This is the way we should think about things. If you don't fall in line with seeing knowledge as objective and neutral, and then if you don't see knowledge in that way, then something is wrong with you, and one might be persecuted. But socially constructed, reflective of the values and interests of those who produce it, general understanding that all knowledge, etc., are connected to a social context. And so this is a particular framework. A lot of the things that we learn are socially constructed. For example, if a person lives in a farming society, there's a knowledge base that is rooted in that society, but somebody out of that context may not understand that. And that's what they mean by socially constructed. But also this idea of universal truth with a capital T, perhaps that's something we are striving for. But then there's a lowercase t too, like my truth, your truth, what's true for your context. But ultimately, this is Dr. Child's viewpoint. I think we're working towards a truth with a capital T as we engage in these intellectual conversations and we get engaged in the notion of teaching and learning, pedagogy. So critical educators guide students along at least three fronts. Claims presented as objective, neutral, universal. Example, Columbus discovered America. That's not objective. That's questionable. How can you discover something that was already here? Okay, so self-reflection about their own social perspective and subjectivity. How the Columbus myth and teachers' racial identity influence what they know and teach about the history of North America. For example, thinking that one's own race is the best and superior, and teaching history from that standpoint. It's called ethnocentrism. But thinking about the we instead of the me in broadening our leadership, our understanding of leadership in a diverse society. Developing skills with which to see, or broadening our educational pedagogical framework in the way we teach, teaching to a broader audience. And we are going to look at things from our own perspective, but being aware of that and trying to broaden our understanding as well. Okay, bullet point 3, developing the skills with which to see, analyze, and challenge ideological domination. Example, rewriting existing school lesson plans to reflect the complexities of the myth of discovery and the political investments in this myth. Just the idea that there were already people groups in North America that were living, breathing human beings just like you and me. They had a way of life that they were engaged in, and for another group of people to come and say they discover that land where people already were living cancels out those people and their value system. It makes them what sociologists call invisible. So just food for thought. So I quote a lot from James Banks. I read a lot of James Banks' work in my master's and doctoral studies. Banks, he has a knowledge typology, and I think this is really helpful as it relates to epistemology. And so when you study philosophy, there are there's a couple of different larger branches of philosophy. You have ontology. It's the study of existence, why we're here, the study of knowing how we got here, what the nature of being in existence, and et cetera and so forth. Ontology even gets into world views and about creation, the creation of the earth, existence, metaphysical kinds of conversations. And then there's epistemology, the study of knowledge, the nature of knowing, how we know what we know, what knowledge is deemed important by society, what knowledge is canceled out. For example, I use the analogy or the example of the history of Africans in the Americas. A lot of the knowledge and information about African Americans is lost because nobody really valued that type of knowledge. They didn't see them as human. But epistemology is the study of the nature of knowledge. So you have 5 different types: personal and cultural knowledge. The way we grew up, I use the example of growing up in a rural society. You have a whole body of knowledge and cultural knowledge that's associated with that way of living. I grew up in an inner city environment and also between the inner city and the suburbs. And so there's a certain type of cultural knowledge that belongs in that direction. I also grew up in a religious environment. And so the framework that we looked at in life often came out of a religious framework and an understanding of God and how we interact with God. And that's a personal and cultural knowledge. Popular knowledge is a lot nowadays what we learn on social media, what we learn on the award ceremonies, the music we listen to, the books that are popular, the cartoons that are popular, the films, Disney, Netflix. This is popular knowledge. And popular culture, sometimes you hear that, and it evolves over time. Like what was popular culture in the 80s, in the 90s, is considered history now. It was popular culture that belonged to that time period, but we did have a different type of popular knowledge now. For example, Netflix did not exist back then, but it's part of the popular culture now. When you say Netflix, people understand that. YouTube is a part of our popular culture, Instagram, social media in general, streaming. Those things did not exist in the 90s or even in the early 2000s, really. But in the 90s, if you wanted to watch a film, you went to a video store. You had VHS tapes, and then later DVDs. Mainstream academic knowledge is what we learn in universities. That's at this particular time, our understanding of science, our understanding of social science, the latest trends and research and the latest breakthroughs. That's mainstream academic knowledge. even like doctors, medical doctors. And then you have traditional medicine that sometimes it's being it challenges mainstream knowledge, alternative medicine, holistic medicine, those kinds of things. School knowledge is what we learn in K-12, and often when we go off to college, that's challenged. And then transformative academic knowledge. I think that kind of knowledge really aligns with what the Frankfurt School was talking about, and critical theorists. They want us not to be in school learning just to learn or reading just to learn, but in what ways can that knowledge empower us to transform society? Knowledge is socially constructed. What people know is based on where they come from. We talked about that. Gene Anion's study, he looks at what is knowledge. And out of his study, he talks about children from poor working class schools. They look at knowledge as remembering things and answering things. But upper class folks are genuine, not in every case, but generally taught thinking up ideas and finding what's wrong with them. That's critical thinking. But often, we found in the study, it's not always the case, but those from poor working class environments remember things and see knowledge as more static and can't be challenged. So every knowledge itself is perceived is different among the social classes. Critical thinking based on expertise of study, results. So this is critical thinking versus opinion. One of the things I want to highlight is we're in a culture where people will put forth their opinion as if it is knowledge. One of the best examples I can bring up is social media debates. Like, one of the things when we see a tantalizing news report on social media, we go straight to many people, maybe not you, but I go straight to the comment section. You can see these heated debates, sometimes 1,000 comments, depending on how popular the idea is. And people are putting forth their opinion and expecting people to accept their opinion as if it's academic knowledge, but it's opinion. What I want us to do as scholars to say, okay, everybody can have an opinion, but it's not on the same level as well-researched knowledge, something that we can back up. I'll give you an example. I like to watch documentaries about aliens and Bigfoot. If I had to pick one, I really like what people are saying about Bigfoot, and there's some really good stuff out there. But there's not a whole lot of evidence to prove it. You may be saying, well, yes, there is, Dr. Childs, but there's not like a lot of irrefutable evidence in the same way that there's proof that tigers exist. Okay, we know that tigers exist, the animals, or black bears, because we've taken pictures. People have had run-ins with them. People keep them as pets. We have video. We have all of this irrefutable evidence that that tigers exist, bears exist, you name it, raccoons, squirrels. If you're like me, I have at least 30 squirrels running around my yard somewhere, everywhere. And they're all in the trees, and maybe 15. And so if you're like me, there's no doubt that squirrels exist. But Bigfoot, we're almost in the opinion realm. You see what I mean? Like, there's much more evidence to prove that the tigers exist than Bigfoot. And so I want us to think about as scholars that we become researchers and don't be distrustful of people's opinion, and be distrustful of knowledge until somebody can really show you some good evidence. That's a good way to be. Okay, that's all I'll do. I actually took longer than I had planned, but we'll continue to do these, and we'll do some more so that you can have something else to help supplement your reading as you go through the book. Is everyone really equal? Thank you. Until next time, have a good day. Bye.